got back from Germany, I understand.
Yes, I did.
Was it a conference or something you were engaged in?
It was a meeting, yes, called the Zurich Dialogues.
Yeah, I'm not sure we were able to get it in the credits, but you're on the faculty of the German Literature Department also?
Also,
At Rutgers?
At Rutgers,
hey,
yeah.
good for you.
Yeah.
I
learned German when I was a child.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah.
I had to pass the exam for the Ph.D., but I can't read. Hello. Welcome very much to our Conversations, where it's a real pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Stephen Bronner. And he's a professor of political science at the Rutgers University. He's also, as we were just chatting, a member of the faculty of German literature there. Right. He's also the editor of a really scintillating, really interesting online site called Logos. He's a senior editor of that. And he's the author of a book. Let's see if we can't show it right here at the outset.
By all means.
He's the author of a book with an interesting title called Reclaiming the Enlightenment. Here's what it would look like in the bookstore, so I'll let you see it. Reclaiming the Enlightenment. Do you want to read the subtitle, Stephen?
It's called Towards the Politics of Radical Engagement.
All right. It's got a nice words in the back by Cornel West and others. And welcome, really, very, very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure to welcome you to.
Thanks so much for having me.
Conversation Manhattan Network. Could you share a little of your own background, please? You know, where you're born and raised. And
well, I grew up in New York, in Washington Heights, and that was an area of German exiles from Hitler. And I learned German as a kid. That's how I got involved in a great deal of European stuff.
Your people were from Germany?
Yeah, yeah.
And they fled the
Nazis? Fled, yeah. That whole neighborhood was really composed of working-class German exiles. And
which part of Germany were they?
My parents?
Yeah.
My father was from a town called Pforzheim.
Pforzheim, I don't know.
Near Stuttgart.
Oh, right, yeah.
And my mother was from Frankfurt and Heidelberg.
And were they being persecuted by the Nazi
regime,
or did they leave out of... there were probably people who were not directly persecuted, but still couldn't abide.
It was very difficult. People, people in my family were persecuted, and others in the family lost their businesses, and they couldn't work, and it got so bad that they had to leave. Yeah.
A lot of the German people went along with that, at least in the early phases, didn't they?
Once Hitler took power, people...
33, was it? Yeah.
Hitler took power in 33, and the opposition collapsed, and people make their way with those in power. They adapt. And I don't want to draw comparisons with Hitler, but it was interesting how once the war was declared, opposition sort of collapsed.
The war in Iraq you're talking about now.
Yeah.
We could cast back to Vietnam, but that's
could
another
do that
issue.
too. But no, if we think about Iraq, the opposition collapsed on the part of the Democrats, and it really took, I think, a combination of people in the streets plus the fact that we started to lose that war, that war got out of hand, that the Democrats have now switched their position.
Yeah, and you've been writing on these things, and so you knew German then. I mean, you know German as well as English?
Yeah.
Good for you. Yeah. That's really good to have two languages or so.
It's luck. I learned it as a child.
Do you remember all the Latin you had to study in 9th grade?
No, that's...
I don't either.
No Latin.
No Latin.
We
didn't remember
do
algebra, all the axioms? I had my kid come with me from the 8th grade algebra. I was so embarrassed, I couldn't remember a thing.
I wish.
You know what I'm saying?
No, I'm afraid the algebra went.
The algebra went?
I'm one of those poor souls who stays with literature, the humanities, and the social sciences.
And political science.
Yeah, political philosophy.
And so, and then you were raised here and you went to school here, I guess.
Went to City College.
Right.
And,
good school.
It was wonderful at the time.
Yeah.
They were really extraordinary teachers. People who really went through a great deal, the resistance, the German exile, Spanish Civil War. I had remarkable
Lincoln
teachers.
Brigades.
Lincoln Brigades, the works.
Yeah.
And it was at City College that I guess the interest in politics was fueled, and the belief that you should say what you think, and that there was an ethical moment in politics which shouldn't be compromised, or at least not compromised so quickly.
You would count yourself among progressive forces in the universe?
I like to think so.
Yeah, okay. That's something we could talk about. What constitutes progressive and what is
Well, I
progress,
think it's,
comp and so forth.
I mean,
notwithstanding,
the
you
sort
know.
of, I guess, in one sense, it's fairly easy to think about. Um, Progressive politics would be based on, I tried to say this in my book,
Yes.
on a sort of unflinching commitment to democracy and civil liberties, a basic commitment to social justice, economic justice, and most important today, a certain what I call a cosmopolitan sensibility.
Comprehensive or
A
global?
cosmopolitan, yeah.
Cosmopolitan used to be applied to Jewish, didn't it? In some
Yeah,
sense?
actually it
and
did.
it was, you know, because they were thought of. How did that happen? How did that
Well,
get linked? Because they were.
Because the Jews didn't have a homeland.
That's right.
They were in the
right.
diaspora.
Right.
And they learned many languages. They lived in many lands. And if you think of what I consider the great tradition of Jewish intellectuals,
Yeah. Maimonides.
well, beginning with Maimonides, but carrying over into the present, people like Moses Mendelssohn, who's today forgotten, great figure, or Heinrich Heine, or Marx, or Einstein, or Hannah Arendt. These were all people who were intelligent enough to temper their nationalist arrogance and nationalist ambitions, and recognize that there are more ways of living than just the ones that we have, and that if we are going to fight for something, we had better be sure, absolutely sure, that the costs outweigh the benefits, that the benefits outweigh the costs. And that's one of the tragedies in this war. There's a certain arrogance.
You think we're in a situation now where the costs are outweighing the benefits?
There's no question about it.
Seems that
Think
way to
about
me,
it.
and obvious, and yet, yeah.
If you think about it, hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent.
A couple hundred at least, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A nation's been torn apart. An infrastructure's been destroyed. The whole region could implode at any point, and Iraq could implode at any point. We've had over 1,000 American soldiers dead, 7,000 mortally crippled, 20,000 wounded, and we don't even think of the amount of people in Iraq. Start with 20,000 dead, which I don't believe.
You think it's higher?
I think it's much higher, and I'll tell you why.
All right.
I and my wife and two editors of Logos were in Iraq before the war. With
Just recently you were there, yeah?
Well, it was just before the war.
Right, okay.
And we were there for a short period, but we got to know some people. And of the people we know, we ourselves know people who've been killed in that war already. If we, who were there for a short time, know a few people who've been killed or nearly killed
You're
in the
speaking
war.
now of civilian Iraqis?
Yeah, Iraqi.
Okay, good. I got you.
If we
put a
know
personal
them,
face on it.
there's got to be a lot more people. Also, if you think about 30,000 bombs were dropped on Baghdad during the first week. And I don't care how precise the bombing.
Shock and awe.
Shock and awe. If you're going to have shock and awe, people are going to die. And we think about collateral damage, but after going there, it's not a word I would use very well. Let me give you an example. There's a shelter that was bombed in the 1991 war with Iraq.
Yeah.
And it was bombed by the United States, and I think maybe it's true that it was believed that Saddam and some of his henchmen were in that shelter. It was in an area that's sort of like Forest Hills, Queens, residential area. And as it happened, there were 400 women and children in that bunker. And we saw how they kept it as a museum. And we saw how a bomb came through the top of the shelter, the steel shelter. And it was like a corkscrew.
I'll be done.
And the corkscrew turned into a flame.
I'll be done.
And with the centrifugal force,
Yeah.
people were pushed against the walls and fried against the walls.
My
And you
God.
can still see the outlines of children and parents. Children and women branded into the wall. I'm a fairly cynical person with regard to politics.
Yeah.
But, and most of the people who were there were fairly cynical, but I don't think anyone could be really that cynical after that, about collateral damage.
And didn't you say on the same trip, I'm not sure, but you were in Iran, and also
That
you
was a
were
different
in
trip.
A different trip, but you were also recently, relatively, the last couple of years, in the occupied territory of the West Bank.
You know, one of the things that happens, and this is why I think a sense of a sensibility, a certain lack of arrogance in foreign affairs is so important. You know, the first administration that went into Iraq after to sort of promulgate the peace, there wasn't anybody who spoke Arabic.
Really?
Yeah. And then it was changed, and Paul Bremer's administration was put in place because of the incompetence of the predecessor. In Iran, one of the things we found was, I was there for a human rights conference, and then we took a tour, my wife and I, and Burns, we took a tour around the country, or parts of the country. And one of the things we found was that every family had 2 books in their possession.
Wait a minute, 2 books? Is this in Iran?
Yeah.
2
So
books.
what?
So let's say one would be the Quran,
Exactly. Now, of course, comes the question: what's the second book?
the Communist Manifesto.
No,
No, I'm joking.
Yeah.
I know. Declaration of Independence? No.
No.
Constitution of the United States?
I didn't. I wouldn't have-
International Declaration of
I
Human
wouldn't have
Rights?
known it either. It
Rights of Man? I give up. What?
their national poet, Hafez,
Uh-huh.
who was actually translated by Goethe. And the only person I know who actually had the answer to this
Would be an
was
Arabian.
somebody who was a Goethe expert, a friend of
Right,
mine. I was in a debate with someone who was
Uh-huh.
talking about, who followed the slogan that still is going around Washington among neoconservatives, that wussies are content with Baghdad. Real men want to go to Damascus or Tehran.
Yeah, they
And,
may have their sights higher, yeah.
And
Yeah.
they didn't know that
The
book.
onslaught.
How do you go into a country if you know nothing about their culture? I asked how many people live in Tehran. The answer one guy gave was, that's the same as in Baghdad. There are 13 million people in Tehran.
That's a big town.
That's a big town.
That's like New York.
That's big. I don't know if it's bigger than New York, but it's a big town.
That's a lot of people.
And
Yeah, it's a big
you know, there's
country,
just a sense that, you know, there's such a lack of fit between our judgment about what's going on and the way people are living over there, that it's just extraordinary.
Yeah, there's a lot of ignorance on the part of the Americans of the rest of the world, given the fact that we are a hyperpower. You think there would be more interest in the world than there seems to be.
Yeah, and you know,
Or understanding of it. Yeah.
Politicians tend to pander to the populace. Thank God that I'm not a politician. I mean, it's just appalling that 40% and 50% of the American population still believes that Saddam was behind the attacks of 9/11. It's just unbelievable.
Do you think that was orchestrated in a subtle way? We did a program once with Vance Packard. Do you remember the Hidden
Sure.
Persuaders?
It was a great book.
And I mean, how much it's so dismaying how much they can lead the people around like sheep.
Yeah, but I
You know,
think
because they touch certain emotional things and they link things. They won't say it necessarily directly, but it comes to be in the people's mind and they plant it there, or it can be done consciously.
But you know, I think in fairness, I mean, I don't mean to sound overly
fair,
or sound unfair.
fair and balanced.
Yeah, I think that the people have a responsibility to know. If in Germany one criticizes the German population for claiming not to have known about the concentration camps,
It wasn't allowed to be a defense at the Nuremberg trials.
I'll
But
tell you.
that's an interesting question.
You know, if you go to Dachau today, where
Yeah.
a concentration
Yeah.
camp was, Dachau's a little town.
Isn't
And
that in Poland?
no,
it's in Germany.
It's right outside of Munich.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
In
yeah.
fact, there's a street.
Oh,
It used
yeah.
to be an artist town.
Okay.
And if you go out there, you can see right in the middle of that town was the concentration camp. And people, after the war, said, well, we didn't know what was going on there. I mean, isn't there some sense of responsibility? Today, all the information on Iraq was out there before the bombing took place. The information with regard to plans regarding Iran and Syria are out there. I mean, don't people have some responsibility to check out sources outside the mainstream media.
Okay, or don't the people in the mainstream media, there's a thing...
those you can't trust to begin with.
Afflict the comfortable, no, bring comfort to the afflicted and afflict the comfortable is an ethic often of editorial journalism, is mostly observed in The Breach.
I was going to say,
yeah. I put that, yeah, and it is, and people have a tendency to do that, and it was, particularly in this last concursion, it was just a stampede, and they really pulled it off in a way, and now they're not taking any hit for it. Nobody has anybody had to resign or anything of that, any accountability. I just had a program with Lucy.
You're absolutely right.
Nobody's had accountability, Mr. You know, like that. The G.A.
General Sanchez
Yeah.
was dismissed, but the people who actually control the policy, the military policy in Iraq, everybody sits and nobody says boo. And the 9/11 Commission didn't say boo.
And the press doesn't. The press doesn't. The press goes along like a lapdog, by and large.
And here I think the American citizenry has an obligation to make its opinions known and to inform itself on alternative types of media. That's why we started Logos. And there are other journals, Counterpunch, and others that have a different point of view. We're not alone. But there's so many, and what I think also has to be said is that the journalists who fell into this, people even on the left who sort of wound up as fellow travelers in Mr. Bush's war, it's time to render them accountable too. This isn't just making a mistake. You know, in baseball or in football, if a coach or a manager leads a losing team, they get fired. And they're replaced by someone else. Now, here's a situation where there's a manifest disaster of monumental proportions, and it's sort of everybody's fault, nobody's fault.
I wonder, we were just chatting. You were at Berkeley in 1970, and I was teaching out there in that part of the world, 71 and that sort of thing. But and they had a piece. James Dow had a piece in the Times a couple of weeks ago, and we just crossed the 1,000 mark of deaths in Iraq of our fellows, and that it was about 1965 that we crossed the 1,000 mark in Vietnam. And in 1965, it wasn't really, it was just ginning up, but it wasn't really politically feasible to run on an anti-war campaign politically in this country, because the nation was still all, by and large, politically, the whole nation was in mind that we are the forces of good and light in the world, which is every nation tries to tell their people that, and that we are going to win by overcoming the opposition of these terrorists that are fighting our good efforts to try and bring peace and justice to them.
You know, Harold,
and then it took until 1975 with 58,000 deaths, and I'm not sure exactly how many, maybe 3 million Southeast Asians were, remember napalm?
Sure.
And they dropped it on innocent women and children. We did that, and Mr. Kerry stood up against that. But people do not...
But he doesn't stand up for it now.
Well, maybe, but it's not politically able. You couldn't do it in Vietnam days because there are not enough people have been slaughtered yet.
But,
so,
you know, even at the...
Do you understand what I'm saying?
But even in those early days, if you recall, I mean, you recall as well as I do, there were politicians of some bravery. People like Wayne Morris.
Gruning, they came out of Oregon.
Gruning, and there's an interesting story.
But they weren't running for president.
They weren't running for president.
No, there wasn't enough. The people want to think that their political entity or their thing, and they're being told that, are all the good of life. Remember in First World War, they got mit uns on the belt. People want to think that they're on the side of good, and if they just persevere, they will win. That seems to be what the Republican convention was largely about. Drawing upon patriotism and the desire to think the system of which you're a part is a force of light and good and enlightenment in the world. We'll get to your book.
If you think back on the great political figures in America, you think about the people you really respect: Martin Luther King, and A.J. Musty, Norman Thomas, even La Follette, Robert La Follette from Wisconsin in 1912. And you think about these kind of people, Upton Sinclair. There's a whole list.
Wasn't The Jungle great? That was such a good book.
But what I was going to say was, the great figures, I think, are the ones who are willing to say something that's unpopular. You know, there's a sense in which, I asked my class.
Oh, we got Kucinich now, but he doesn't have a snowball's chance in Hades of getting elected.
True.
The zeitgeist is not caught up, maybe. Although, if I may, this fellow Dow wrote, he said that because of the media, I mean, remember they used to have body bag counts every Friday? And they used to have to get the pictures developed somewhere, and it took time. And now it's right on the internet, and it's right there in front of us. They're cutting off a guy's head in Iraq. It's right in front of you, and the violence and that is there. But he said that he reckons, he was doing a calculation, it would be sort of like, given the media context and the richer media mix, particularly multimedia capability and so on, that it's more along the lines of there's close to about 15,000 of our guys have been killed. And that it may be that is telescoping, and that the people will be able to, because it's now being recognized even by, McCain and other people, that it's a quagmire there. But so it may still come to be relevant in the election here in November, a month and a half from now.
I'm sure it will. But
I mean, in a positive, progressive way.
I hope so. But I really do feel it's essential for people to begin seriously speaking out. That John Kerry should have taken so long.
He spoke pretty well at NYU the other day.
Yes, he did. Yeah. But that it should have taken so long for him to wage a clear attack is simply appalling. And for the secondary politicians in New York, Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, it's even more appalling. I mean, these guys, in some way, if they're to be respected, they have to say what they think. And,
well, their first responsibility is to get elected. And if you're running for president, you can't run on a platform that will assure you're not getting elected.
Think about now Harold Dean. All right, he was knocked out of the box, but he wasn't knocked out of the box simply because of the positions he took on Iraq.
Who?
Howard Dean.
Howard Dean, yeah, right. Yeah. Well, that was probably an orchestrated thing within the party, maybe even.
Perhaps.
Yeah, but that's politics. That's hardball politics. Yeah.
But if you're going to talk about yourself as a progressive, as a critic, and especially as an intellectual, as a political figure, now, the running for president is the extreme case. But everyday people, and then intellectuals, and then people in the party at different levels of government, it's up to them to speak out. I mean, it's just not that important, if you like, getting that extra vote as against seeing people die for no reason.
Well, that's one thing. For a politician is one thing, or for somebody running for the chairman of the board of a big multinational corporation and that kind of, there's one thing, but a politician, but for the intellectual community to fall down.
Sure.
That's really sad, because intellectual people often have tenure. They've got a situation. They can speak truth to power without it even hurting their career. Although if we let it go too far, they'll start associating people who speak out even in tenured positions at universities as siding with the enemy. Remember Joe McCarthy, how far we got down that path, and COINTELPRO and all that kind of stuff?
We're not there.
I mean, it can happen to us too.
Right. We're not there yet.
But we're in that direction. Patriot Act.
But the direction is there, and it's up for people in the university to, as you put it, speak truth to power. But how many people do that?
Well, even the universities are susceptible to those systems by which the lines are assigned, and there's this economic thing where people, unless you get one tenure, if you get tenure, then you got a certain thing. But public intellectuals, there's public intellectuals, and the public intellectual community is not calling the country to task. And even Mr. Kerry is still trying to say, well, I'll send more troops and we will whip them. We saw Mr. Edwards say, we're going to whip the bejesus out of them. We're going to win. We're going to win. In Vietnam, we finally had to say, as Mr. Kerry said, we made a mistake. We were wrong.
Yeah.
Now, nobody wants to say they're wrong.
And that's precisely where I think we have to begin. It's not just, there was a miscalculation. The whole way of thinking that led us into this war, the type of manipulation that was engaged in, the sense that we can simply walk in and impose our will as we wish upon any country as we choose.
Full spectrum dominance.
Yeah.
Over the whole planet. Bunker busting tactical nuclear weapons.
And here, I think one of the great traditions that comes out of
That's why I wanted to get to your book.
Yeah, is a sense, again, of trying to build international consciousness. The UN was good enough when we went into Afghanistan. Later, the Iraq thing comes, they're irrelevant and ineffective. There has to be some commitment to international law. Otherwise, we have no vantage point from which we begin our criticism of really dictatorial regimes.
Right.
When the idea of suggesting that every critic of American foreign policy was somehow in bed with Saddam is simply appalling. When we were in Iraq, we put out our group, it was called Conscience International, put out a petition. It was signed by 33,000 people. There was no, it was quite clear that we did not approve or support Saddam's regime, but that we were equally critical of what would happen should America invade, precisely because of, well, we had a sense of what would happen. And this actually came out in Logos, and your audience can check it out.
And more or less what was in Logos is now on the ground in Iraq.
I mean,
you were
alone.
prescient. There were others who did.
This.
Some people had the knowledge.
Every person we spoke to, critics of Saddam who spoke on sly, and actual supporters of his party, everybody said, you're going to have it easy coming in, but once you're there, you better get out fast.
Well, you're going to have it easy militarily because you're
that's
a super.
what they meant.
Well, a Sherman tank is a pretty big thing.
But once we're there, we're going to be. If you stay, you're going to be treated as the invader, and everyone will.
Occupier. Remember, we just came out of a period where, for 500 years, the Western powers had been colonizing the rest of the world, and they've only just come back. So a lot of people, most of the world will see that as a neo-colonial kind of occupation of the world with our full spectrum dominance ideas. And how much of that is growing out of your book, Reclaiming the Enlightenment? Why don't we back up a little bit, if we can, and talk about
why it's important.
And may I say one thing at the outset, and you can offset it or set me straight, because it's not my area. But I read with some interest. Haven't been able to get to them. I'd like to do the program, but I once read a book or looked at it by an Arthur Herman, and he'd written a book a couple years back, and it was called How the Scots Invented the Modern World and Everything in It. He's a serious historian out of Maryland. And he said that it was largely from the Scottish Enlightenment, he said, more than the French. I don't know, we want to get into a whole Trotskyite kind of
there's an argument to be made that people like David Hume, Adam Smith.
Steam engine was invented up there,
who came from Scotland, were crucial in the Enlightenment. But you can pick any country, and you can find your major figures, Thomas Jefferson in the United States.
The Scottish were very well represented as signers of the Declaration of Independence, it was said, in the United States. And you had this revolution that was coming out of the United States. But if I'm saying, there was an enlightenment that happened. We have been living for 500 years under a feudal order. I guess it's called in French ancien regime.
The old order.
There was the old order. It held for 500 years of these dynastic states and that, or more than that, and so forth. So then there came this thing called the Enlightenment. I don't want to get into whether it was the Scottish Enlightenment or the French Enlightenment or that, but there was the Enlightenment. Why don't you share with myself and the general audience, when did that occur? What constituted it? What were some of the major figures, Voltaire, whoever was involved in that? And let's try and get a grounding for what we call the modern world, that the United States is now saying we're into a modernist or a postmodern world, and the values that are behind and underlie that we are trying to, in a certain sense, impose upon the world through our neo-colonial expansion of military power.
Basically, what the Enlightenment was about was the following. It was a movement that was international in character. In England, in France, in Germany, in Italy.
Was it in China? Was it in China?
No,
was it in India? It was a European thing?
No, but its values extended to South America and to even to Haiti, where an anti-slave revolution was led by Toussaint Louverture in the early 19th century. But usually you think about the Enlightenment as taking place in the 17th and 18th centuries, beginning of the 19th century. And its basic ideas were very simple. Its basic ideas were that in order for people to be free, they have to be able to contest or be free from the dogma of religion. They have to be able to look at the world and begin to make sense of it through science. That they have to be free to do so, that is to say, live in some kind of open democratic order. That they should be able to read books and have the benefit of civil liberties, to engage in discourse and to organize as they like. And to put it just, that the world has to, that the injustices that exist, economic, political, and so on, are in need of reform. We need plans to change the economy of society.
Reform or revolution?
No, reform. Really
Okay.
reform.
Okay.
And
It's an
lastly,
important distinction.
yes, there is.
Yeah.
Although many can say that the Enlightenment generated the American Revolution, or the English Revolution, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. You can even make an argument that their type of thinking, which called for really a transformation of the economic thinking, the political thinking, and the religious thinking of the old regime.
And the social thing, yeah.
Yeah.
So
social
and the
thinking.
cultural thing.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a big thing.
It's a big thing.
Yeah.
And what is so impressive about it is that it called for the constraint of the arbitrary exercise of power.
By particularly referring to
The church, the aristocracy, and, if you like, all the institutions that relied on the old regime.
The how do you say it in French? Ancien?
The ancien regime.
Ancien?
Ancien.
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 Ancien. We should learn
Regime.
that.
My French
Yeah,
is terrible.
ancien. And we have mine
But it
too.
basically means the old regime.
It means the old regime, and that was because you had these kings, and you had this divine right of kings.
Let me give you
And here's this revolution comes out of the United States across this bunch of, bumpkins across the Atlantic Ocean and formed La Miserable of France. They cut off Louis XVI's head, didn't they?
Well, that was a bit later. But
Was that part of that? I mean,
well,
that was part of the Ancien regime, the Louis XVI in Versailles.
Well, certainly that was.
And it was pretty drastic to cut off their head.
And you can make an argument that a lot of thinkers who pushed for civil liberties and pushed for a critique of the Ancien regime were actually very critical of that act.
Critical of the cutting off of the head?
Very critical.
They would have been more reformist than...
Yeah.
But these things have a way of getting out of hand, don't they?
Yeah.
Oh.
But unless the attempt is made, we would still be living under the dominance of a single church and its dogma. We'd still be living under a reigning aristocracy, and we'd still be living with with an order in which, well, there's a famous, the great play, The Marriage of Figaro, which Mozart turned into an opera.
Yeah.
There was what was called the clarion call. The revolution came up in the play, but not in the opera. And it was written by Beaumarchais, a French playwright, who actually organized the ships and the arms, some of the ships and the arms, that the French sent to the United States for the revolution.
Yeah.
And the line was the following. Figaro, the barber, says to the Count, what have you ever done to justify the privileges you have besides being born?
Right.
Yeah.
Divine right of the dukes.
Well, you think of many kids of many rich kids. I'm sorry, the kids of many rich families. What have they ever done besides being born?
Well,
into the
that's
right
what
family?
I say, and I don't want to lose this track about back to the beginning of the Ancien regime, because I'd like to, because we had a period in, history is a many splendored thing. We got 200,000 years of being around on this planet. There's been a lot of things going on, and we had a thing in the, Michelangelo. We had a thing called the Renaissance. It was in the arts and culture and so forth. Then we had another thing that happened, and those things must happen in some dialectic evolution of the evolving of the whole system. So why did the Enlightenment happen in the 16th, 17th, 18th century rather than in the 4th century? So there's some connection to the historical evolution.
Sure, there's a
things. So, but
what's interesting is that it should have happened internationally. That's what's interesting.
Well, it didn't happen in China, are you saying?
No, but I mean internationally within the West.
It had something to do with the rise of capitalism and.
Yeah, but and there's a big but. The values of the Enlightenment, things like tolerance, the need for some kind of law, liberal rule of law in which the punishment fits the crime, some sense that fairness before the law was necessary, some sense that leaders are accountable to their people. This is something you can find in all cultures.
Yeah, in all religions too,
and in
can't
all
you?
religions.
In the better
And
representation.
what is interesting about the Enlightenment is that it crystallized something that I think happened in many different civilizations. And for us today, I think its values form the basis of a tradition upon which progressive politics has to base
We're back to
itself.
progressive again. And
Yeah.
and then that gets back to what's it all about, Alfie, and who is on the side of progression, and what is going on. I mean, it gets into these bigger issues.
Yes.
But I want to get back to that train if we can. But I wonder, do you think it's possible now, we live in a world, because you talked to, we remember Vietnam, it was seared in my being, because
Sure.
I got very involved in that kind of thing, and we lost, anyway, that kind of thing. But that on the February 13th, or was it 15th of 2000, before the war, there was this massive demonstration all over the
Sure.
world, and you had through internet and that kind of thing connection, people were all rising up all over the world. And it seems to me, Stephen, it seems to me that if you cast back through all of history, it's always been a gang of guys who control everything like mafia dons. I mean, in Rome, you had the emperor, you had the people who did, and the masses of the people were by and large wallowing around in the mud as serfs and peasants and so forth. In Athens, it was based upon a slave class. And overwhelmingly, most
Yeah,
people
of
were
course.
slaves. You've always had a few people who run things, and we still have a few people in each country. We have a few plutocrats, whether or not it's a governmental thing or a business-backed kind of thing where a few people own all the assets and so forth.
But
And you have development. But do you think it is that if we look at now, so you've got, we're asserting our legitimacy, that is the United States, or the people that, and you had, the New York Times famously said then you have two superpowers, the United States and then world public opinion. United States, saw Zbigniew Brzezinski on television the other day, he said never in the history of our modern experience has the United States been in lower esteem by the people around the world in every country.
In
all
every
over.
country.
Is there any possibility, or is it like some dreaming thing or something, that they are finally going to be enough pressure exerted by the people, awakened, the masses, not the plutocratic people who run each of the various countries, and there's maybe 20% and they trade off with each other and get advantages and have a few running dog institutions that run, but that there's going to be a reaction to the system that's in place, and that would be like the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, much of the nation states. The whole system that's in place will be seen in a historical context and call themselves legitimate as representing a modern-day ancien regime that's been in place for 200 years, and its time is passing because they have systems that do not meet the needs that the future call for of involving all of the human society. Are we at a revolutionary time vis-a-vis the system that's in place and claims legitimacy?
Let me suggest something in this regard. You're right. In some way, that policy, especially foreign policy, has always been made behind the backs of the people. That's a tradition, and that was true even, and that was true up through the present. But something interesting happened, I think, and I think you can always almost mark it with Vietnam, which is that somehow this notion, which great Enlightenment figures, whether Immanuel Kant in Germany or Marx or any number of other, Voltaire, any number of people have always criticized. In some way, during the Vietnam period, what became clear was that this kind of activity, this kind of planning of foreign policy behind the backs of the people in a democracy is somehow illegitimate. And it seems to me that what has happened since Vietnam and what the conservatives and neoconservatives can't swallow
Absolutely.
is the demand that foreign policy be open to some kind of public and democratic censure or a democratic voice.
Why limit it to public policy? Why not limit it to the whole
Foreign
assumptions
policy.
under which society is organized?
Yes, I
the
would-
basic assumptions. Louis XVI and the people of Versailles had certain assumptions about how a society
Yeah.
should be organized. It held for 200, 500 years or more. We've had one for 200 years, and the basic assumptions under which these institutions are formed,
Indeed.
and which our institutions are predicated and built upon certain assumptions of human nature, human way, the technological intermix between people and society, the realities that are involved, the need for a real democracy, economic as well as political, justice, all of those things will not be served by the institutions that are part of that historical legacy of the Enlightenment.
That's the question.
To
me, in this regard, if we're going to talk about furthering social justice or economic justice, and we're going to talk about extending democracy, and we're going to talk about furthering a democratic input into foreign policy and pushing, let's call it a cosmopolitan sensibility, you're inherently driven back to the Enlightenment.
Okay.
It's very interesting. There's a book that just came out by Gertrude Himmelfarb. I actually reviewed it for the
I got the review. I read it. Yeah, it was interesting. Right. But that's like a counter Enlightenment movement that apparently is abroad, huh?
Gertrude Himmelfarb is the wife of Irving Kristol, one of the leaders of the neoconservative movement.
They're in the saddle now.
And they're trying to appropriate the Enlightenment to foster the policies of President Bush, compassionate conservatism, and even, in a certain way, the Anglo-American alliance against the French and the Continentals. And that's the Enlightenment is being interpreted in such a way as to foster that kind of politics.
What I want
to do is take that back and suggest that there's a radical quality in the Enlightenment.
A progressive radical quality.
Progressive radicalism. And it's great figures like Voltaire and Lessing in Germany, and Francis Bacon in England, and David
Locke
Hume, and Locke, and the whole group of them that came together under what was called a republic of letters, that is to say, an international exchange to foster the values of humanity. And this is not idealistic. Unless one has some idea of humanity, one doesn't have an idea of international law, or one doesn't have an idea of how you curb the nationalist ambitions and the xenophobic assumptions of different states. And it seems to me that the Enlightenment is the place to start in doing this. It's a complicated phenomenon. We can't go into all of it. But that's the place to begin. And what I wanted to do was, in a certain way, take tradition away from the conservatives.
Take away from the neocons?
Yeah, and say that progressive people also have a tradition. In America, it becomes clear, if you think of Teddy Roosevelt and the late Teddy Roosevelt, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Martin Luther King, and so on. But it also goes further back. It goes back to an attempt by a rising bourgeois class, a rising, a new modern society, representatives of a modern society, to foster the values of science, the best values of science, to foster a constraint on the arbitrary exercise of power, and to foster a reform of the inequities that have plagued us since civilization began.
Well, one of the great forces, if I may, in the progressive force was you threw it out there among the people that were part of the history, was Karl Marx. And Karl Marx had a thing called the Communist Manifesto, and there was a critique, a socialist critique of, and somebody once said, was it O'Neill, said all politics is local? In a certain sense, all politics is, Tip O'Neill, but all politics is economic. There's an economic assumption that informs political process and political institutions.
But there's something that should be understood with
and
this.
If I may, that you had Karl Marx who critiqued the institution of private property, and that we had, 2/3 of the world population there for a while read the Communist Manifesto, Mao's little book, and so forth. And there was a containment thing, there was that, to institute the institution of private property. The socialist critique is said by the neocons to have gone into the dustbin of history with the implosion of the Soviet Union and now the galloping capitalization. And capitalism has won. Francis Fukuyama tells us it's the end of history. There's no more history, it's all decided, so it's just a matter of how you arrange it. So they're taking that kind of a view based upon economic theory and safeguarding the institution of private property that the socialists just did away with.
Let me, I actually did a book on the socialist tradition, which is called Socialism Unbound.
Okay.
So, which actually deals with Marx and Lenin and Edward Bernstein and Rosa Luxemburg, and actually how you think about socialism
Well,
today.
the left, the progressive left, tends to have critiqued the private property ownership. They're now very worried that they're going to privatize Social Security. They're going to, Mr. Bush is beginning to talk about the ownership solution.
If you think about what, I mean, if you cut away all the rhetoric, and you think about what did the labor movement want, what did socialism mean?
Right.
It meant, in the most basic sense, not a dictatorship, but rather mitigating what I call the whip of the market. If you look at Europe, what you'll find is those movements of the 19th century that called themselves Marxist, mass movements of workers, became the bulwark for the parliamentary regimes that existed in the 20s, and which were displaced by fascism. They were anti-fascist, these labor movements. And after the Second World War, they also became the base of the new regimes, the mass base of the new regimes that emerged. So the idea that there is only one road that goes from Marx to Lenin to Stalin to Mao Zedong, this is nonsense. This is just nonsense. It's historically not true.
Well, what about
Sure,
go ahead. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
If you think of what the mass labor movements wanted, I mean, what did socialism mean? This is something we've had taken away from us. Socialism meant social security. It meant national health insurance. It meant workers' compensation. It meant a minimum wage. It meant child labor laws. It meant free public schools. It meant state schools. It meant free libraries. It meant a socialist public sphere in which you have daycare and things like that.
All this pesky interference with the free market.
Precisely, mitigating the whip of the market.
Right,
That's what it
or
meant.
the market, and now the market, we got social Darwinistic market fundamentalism is in the saddle now.
Yeah,
right?
and it's one of these completely ridiculous things in which
the market can solve everything.
which the market can solve
Maybe
everything.
just get them, just get their government off the backs of the business guys, and then they will solve everything. And just give the full and you've got you got Grotius, you got some international law that evolved, but we still live in a nation states, and yet internationally they can just go and hide banking accounts. They can do all kinds of things internationally. So it's just absolutely they're in the saddle.
Now the question is, in a certain way, where did these ideas of social security, national health insurance, a national bureaucracy even, a reasonably efficient bureaucracy, where did these ideas for reform come from? What's their root? And in a certain way, their root comes out of Enlightenment figures, Alexander von Humboldt,
great geographer.
Great geographer.
I did my degree in geography.
There you go.
Yeah.
Beccaria.
Yeah.
There were a whole bunch of people who were concerned with things like this, and they, in a certain way, come out of the Enlightenment. This kind of democratic socialism, this attempt to mitigate the injustices of the market, and the liberalism that commits itself to parliamentarism, these are the two great, so shall I say, children of the Enlightenment. And it's interesting that every anti-Enlightenment movement, neocons...
You call them anti-Enlightenment.
Yeah.
But do you think they would say they're in keeping with the real intent of the Enlightenment? They would be in... It's like Trotskyites deciding how many differences...
Let me put it to you this way. It would be a very idiosyncratic reading of the Enlightenment that they have.
Yeah, but you have a particular prejudice bias. They would say that yours is probably prejudice, right? And then they will put on an election, and it looks like maybe their guy's going to win this election now, and they're going to go galloping with the bit in their mouth into the future.
If you look back, and this is, I think, traditionally, what you get is basically even Gertrude Himmelfarb would say, I'm not someone who buys simply the primacy of reason. I'm not someone who buys the critique of tradition. I'm not someone who simply stands, who's concerned fundamentally with the whip of the market as it affects everyday people. I'm not someone who stands for cosmopolitanism over national sentiments. These, so her Enlightenment is going to, or the people she picks, who are mostly, by the way, anti-Enlightenment figures in which she grounds her vision on, the people she picks are going to support those values. And, I mean, you can sort of change anything around to justify anything.
That's what I'm saying, they can.
But in a certain way, there's something basically dishonest about this. And everybody who has some cognizance of that republic of letters, you know that these people are not for religion. Voltaire. I mean, just what rings in the popular imagination, if you mention the name Voltaire or Goethe or David Hume. I mean, they wanted religion out of the public realm. Religion is a private interest. Or as Voltaire put it so nicely, he said, a country which has one religion alone, chances are it's going to be a tyranny. A country which has two religions probably will be engaged in civil war. A country with 30 religions, well, then everybody can go and pray in their mosque and then go to bed and pull their covers over their heads at night and sleep safely.
Yeah, well, that's a critique on the religious front. But on the economic front, this idea...
There was a commitment to capitalism, but the vision they had of capitalism was of a very... it's almost like...
They kept slaves.
But most Enlightenment figures were critical of slavery. And
finally. They didn't give the woman the vote until 1920 in this country.
But if you think of who are the major figures who called for the vote for women, and what you'd come up with is people like Olympe de Gouges, the great French feminist, who would be an Enlightenment figure.
Catholic Church only let Galileo off the hook about 4 years ago for talking about it being
if you want to see where the Enlightenment
universe
began internationally, Galileo, Francis Bacon, Newton.
Yeah, so it was an intellectual thing.
Sure.
And it moved and it established certain kinds of institutions, but on the economic front...
ideas are a threat to the true believers.
Right, okay.
That's always the
Well,
case.
what I'm suggesting is that the system that's in place that calls itself legitimate is part of a modern-day ancien regime. That the future is, as the future called for an alternative way, in a massive way, for society to be organized as the technology was advanced, the Industrial Revolution was coming in, changes were happening. It called for a change from a land-based feudal system 200 years ago.
Right.
So there is the need for that kind of a change now from the institutions that are there in place now and are proudly proclaimed by the people who represent that. But that there's something new going on, blowing in the wind. There's something new. And it would be coming out of some of the economic realities evolving out of technological development.
True.
We've now got these technological developments. We've got a revolution in every field. We're coming to understand things in a qualitative way.
Sort of like
and we've reached a point where we can...
stem cell research, which the neoconservatives, of course, oppose.
Right, okay, right, all right. Yeah, but what I'm trying to say, in a certain sense, it's not just the neoconservatives, it's the whole system.
Yes, I agree.
It's the whole system, that there's something new, really big, so that the people who are nervous about that change, they must have been nervous at the Palace of Versailles when Les Miserables started rebelling, and that they assume that they have the means by which they are going to be able to navigate this war. But the basic assumptions by which those institutions are established are out of sync with what the world requires for the future involving the masses of the world. And we don't have that.
And maybe,
we don't have an economic system or a political view
that
can encompass that which is going to come to be necessary if we're going to have liberation for our children and grandchildren.
But maybe part of the way to look at this is, one, in terms of what values do you want to critique the present system? And I think what you find is, as a progressive person, the values you use to critique the inequities of the present system will be precisely those that emerged in the Enlightenment. And two, it may very well be that as our current system evolved, it betrayed the original principles that inspired it.
Well, okay.
It seems to me that if you think of those principles radically, Martin Luther King is an example. In his speeches, he looked back to the Declaration of Independence and he looked back to the slave spirituals, fit together perfectly, and said, look here, you guys say you're a democracy. You claim that there's the rights of each individual are protected, and here we have a whole group of people whose rights are not protected. You take one step further and you say, look here, you say that this is a land of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what if a majority of people are plunged into misery, and I mean misery.
Yeah. It could be coming en masse.
I think that there is a misery that is here that is unseen and
and growing. And the trends are growing.
The working poor.
Yeah. They're going to increase.
Families of four.
They're going to increase.
In the Bronx.
Yeah.
Is one
Not only here, but
example.
in the world. And Keynes, if I may, I would say that we've all based it on this labor theory of value, a surplus labor theory of value.
Marxist.
And the thing is, the technology is displacing us. Keynes said in 1930 in that letter to his grandchildren that there is facing something that they are going to have technological displacement of labor in the productive process. We distribute all income to everybody in all the systems through labor criteria. We have a wage slave system that keeps social control.
By the way, that actually
it's all owned. It's all owned. The capital assets increasingly responsible for production are owned by a plutocratic group like the overlords. And we don't have a system. And the left has got its legs cut off because it's all talking about labor's rights, and labor is being undercut by technological success. So we've got a real problem, and we don't have a system that addresses that.
I think
but our real problem is we've only got about 40 seconds left.
Well, I think we've come a long way.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just sort of say this, that it seems to me that there's certain general principles that we have to recognize. The commitment to liberty against the Patriot Act now.
Yeah.
The commitment to social justice. This is the only war, the Iraq War, in which people's the safety net of welfare programs have been cut out from under them.
Yeah.
Every other war came with a social welfare net. And it's time for us to recognize that we are one nation in the world, among others, and that we have to come to terms with a global we have to begin to generate what I call a global politics based on some sense of equity and the constraint of arbitrary power.
Absolutely, and in keeping with the way things are actually being produced rather than the way they have been produced in the past.
Indeed.
And that calls for a new economics and a new politics. And if anywhere where they could go to begin to get some sort of an understanding of what can help you do it, it would be good to go to this book, if I may say so.
Which is published by
Reclaiming the Enlightenment.
Which is published by Columbia University.
University. I think we got a link to it here that they can get to, and you're well advised to do that. And thanks a lot for Logos.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It was a great pleasure.
Well, we're run out of time talking, but it's your pleasure. You can go to Logos. It's a really good site on the internet. And thanks a lot for coming. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful.
Okay. Thank you for viewing. We'll be coming back again tomorrow. Stephen, once again, thanks again very, very much.
Anytime.
Okay. So we get carried away, but I just have this feeling that it's really like we're coming into a birth of something really very big is blowing in the wind, and it's not being addressed in a large way because we're resting on our laurels. We have these institutions that we think are in place.
Indeed.
But the institutions are not adequate
I think we have to orient
what
ourselves.
the future is going to require.
And I think we have to orient ourselves. History is a long process, and we have to begin to recognize that we're part of a trend that has historical roots.
Absolutely, 200,000 years.
Yeah, but also that the left, the modern left, has to situate itself in terms of a tradition and not think everything it does is new.
And also not get itself undercut by assumption.
Sure.
They're going to have to address this displacement of labor's value in the productive process.
That was Marx's big point.
Well, yeah.
That really, before Keynes, that's really Marx's point.
Yeah.
That you're going to have technology displacing workers.
Yeah.